Did you grow up in a narcissistic family system with at least one narcissistic parent, or didn't you? Just sit with that question, because this can have a significant impact on how you experience a narcissistic relationship. You know this, but I'm going to go deeper with this. Now, don't get me wrong. Neither is pleasant or uncomfortable being in a narcissistic relationship, whether depending on your family of origin, but it can be very different experientially. So let's start if you did grow up with a narcissistic parent or parents. Your experience of trauma bonding, even in that family of origin, is much more primal. Love and attachment would get conflated with all the shape-shifting of the parents, the lack of attunement, and having to accommodate to what the parent expected simply in order to be loved or even noticed. And recognizing that for you to be loved meant that you would have to become what the parent wanted you to be. There was no room for your needs or this sense of you as a separate person. Now, if you did exert yourself in that relationship, then you were selfish or greedy or bad or ungrateful. Now, this means that going forward, that all relationships you have from that parental relationship forward can be pretty fraught, and your safety responses such as fawning, freezing, disappearing into yourself, capitulating and giving in, they all become a sort of normal in your relationship. And that means that you learn to be in a relationship means a chronic back and forth of fear and love. And that to be in a relationship means you have to quit on any true self you have, and that doesn't feel good. But that craving to be in a relationship can also be very compelling. That middle ground of being in a relationship and also being able to be yourself is not something that gets to evolve as an option if you had a narcissistic parent or parents. And this can play out in friendships, workplaces, but most pointedly in intimate relationships. And it's in the intimate relationship where we see that the psychological wear and tear of the parental trauma-bonded relationship really shows up. Because intimate relationships tend to bring up more primal emotions. There's a vulnerability to getting sort of caught or stuck in the vortex of the dynamics of adult narcissistic close relationships, the love bombing, the justifying, and the familiarity of all these feelings, all of the self-blame and the confusion and the feeling like you're not enough or not being enough, and then getting caught in the cycle of having to prove yourself and also rationalize their behavior. We almost, when we have the narcissistic parents, we almost reflexively accommodate to the unreasonable demands of the relationship, and we quietly and ultimately sort of abandon ourselves. The reactions can be quite complicated. If you have not had the opportunity to explore your childhood dynamics, really what happened in your family of origin, it may mean that you may not even clock what's happening in your adult relationship as narcissistic abuse, right? Especially the ones when you were younger in adulthood. Now, over time, as you have more and more of these relationships, you can see it more clearly. But when we have narcissistic parent, it takes a while. And a lot of the support and healing to see that we need that, to see that we're being gaslighted and that we're being invalidated. And then we have to be able to shift our schemas within ourselves to give ourselves permission to see all of this. But all of that said, when we have a narcissistic partner in adulthood, after having had a narcissistic parent in childhood, what else looks different? Well, in some ways, the adult relationship with a narcissist doesn't register the same way, especially in the beginning. And even as you start to accommodate and cut off parts of yourself to make it work, then as the dynamics become clear, or at least clearly toxic, it can feel like a mountain of grief coming at you, especially if it's the first time you're connecting all of these dots. There can be a sense that the familiarity of something toxic was, again, reproducing and made you vulnerable to not seeing it and to getting stuck. And a whole mix of emotions can overwhelm you. Anger, grief, more anger, helplessness. But unless you've worked through all this trauma-bonded stuff that you had with a parent, it's going to be equally difficult to cut the ties in an adult relationship. Most people who are what I call legacy or family survivors of narcissistic abuse don't always see the patterns. They don't see that similarity between their childhood relationship with a parent and their adulthood relationships for a long time. And when they do, it almost feels like someone got away with playing a really long, terrible practical joke on you. You have like a rueful laugh, a shake of the head, a sort of glum like, of course, or here we go, or really? And it's not surprising as much as it feels like a heaviness. It can almost feel like something destined, a curse you couldn't outrun. Many people do, and some of the outrunning the family narcissism curse is sort of dumb luck. And some of that is people who did the hard work on the parent stuff before they got into adult relationships. Now, there doesn't tend to be a lot of, I can't believe it, or even confusion, like, what the hell is all this toxic behavior? It's more of a, of course, I've heard this song somewhere before, and I didn't get it, but now I know what it is, and here it is again. But what about the people who do not grow up with a narcissistic parent? You may have had healthy enough parents. Maybe they weren't even the most stellar parents, but they were definitely not narcissistic. Maybe they were somewhat dull. Maybe they were somewhat disinterested. Maybe, I don't know, they were too young, but they didn't subjugate you. An unhealthy parent is not always a narcissistic parent. Remember that. But let's just say you had sort of a normal childhood. You got to be you. You didn't have to develop an early schema that all relationships are transactional, that you have to be what the other person wants to be loved or even to get your needs met, or that you're selfish for even expressing a need, or that you have to invest your sense of self into either keeping the family safe or rebelling against it. You're a bit more carefree. You get to be a kid. You have healthy relationships. And for the purposes of this video, let's just assume that you are not narcissistic. So then, coming from that sort of healthy-ish family of origin, you meet a narcissistic partner in adulthood. Same drill, love bombing, great fun, super. It can feel like this is your person. And why not? For you, growing up in a normal family, happy relationships seem like a possibility. Hell, they might seem like a probability. And then as time goes on and you do normal relationship things, you make your needs known, you share your beliefs, you fight back when your reality is doubted and your perceptions and memories are questioned. And this can go on for a while. But as it happens for a while and you do start to love this person, the gaslighting starts to confuse you. Again, especially if you really do love this person and you feel committed and want this relationship to last. And you question yourself. For people who did not have narcissistic parents and, though, are in a narcissistic adult intimate relationship, you are more likely to feel crazy in these relationships. Fact is, this is sort of old hat for those of us who grew up with narcissistic people around us. So while it doesn't feel good for people who grew up with a narcissistic parent or parents, it actually doesn't leave them feeling crazy. But if you aren't from this narcissism stuff in your family, it feels insane. You feel insane. And again, the trauma-bonded patterns can mean that there are enough good moments. So you may also have what can feel like normal rationalizations for what's going wrong in the relationship. That your partner is having a bad day or a bad week or has a stressful job, whatever it may be. The trauma bonding feeling with an adult partner then becomes less panicky, less physiological, though it may partly feel like that. And more you're trying in an adult narcissistic relationship to make sense of what's happening. You're invested in the relationship because you've spent time in it, maybe because you have kids, maybe because you have a home together, or maybe simply because of good old love. But over time, people who are what I'm going to call the non-legacy survivors, you didn't have narcissistic parents, can sort of be in a what the F situation. What is this? Like, what is happening? What is wrong? And you may even be less likely to personalize it. There may be some of that, but not the same way there would be for someone who grew up with a narcissistic parent. For people who didn't have narcissistic or traumatizing parents, your sense of self had a stronger start. And don't get me wrong, even if your only narcissistic relationship is in adulthood, it can still erode your sense of self in adulthood, especially in a marriage or a very long-term committed relationship. but that established sense of self is there. And instead of despair, people in adult narcissistic relationships who didn't have those kinds of parents can feel a heavy sense of confusion and may try to approach your adult relationship like a problem that can be addressed or solved. You may be open to couples therapy, family therapy, and you may be vulnerable to future faking because you may actually believe that people can change, right? Both, no matter how you get into an adult narcissistic relationship, you're going to suffer. Don't get me wrong about that. But it looks and feels different depending on your family of origin story. And you only have your story, but if you know someone else who's also going through a narcissistic relationship, it may very well be that some of their experience is different than yours because of these different histories. Trust me, it sucks for both of you. But you may find yourself feeling it differently or communicating about it differently in terms of how you talk about it. In adult relationships that are more severe, with enough time, especially when there are circumstances of coercive control, those narcissistic relationships can culminate in what looks like complex trauma and that embodied sense of psychological unsafety. But in the more moderate narcissistic relationships, not so much. Keep in mind, too, that people who did not grow up in narcissistic families may be more likely to have access to more validating sources of support than those who did, which can also facilitate ultimately seeing it more clearly and, again, not feeling as crazy. Everyone ultimately feels somewhat crazy in a narcissistic relationship, but it's a different kind of crazy and a different sense of despair depending on your backstory. It's the many shades of messed up that happen in narcissistic relationships, but it's different. The charm, the charisma, the confidence, and the fakery of the narcissistic person can mean that they're attractive to anyone. And if you get too far down the track with them, it's always hard to leave. It never makes sense to compare pain, our pain with someone else's pain. Both groups, no matter your family of origin, are in pain. Both groups blame themselves in narcissistic relationships. But the despair versus crazy and the approach to fixing it can look quite different depending on where the story started for you. I remember so well having a friend who was going through a terribly narcissistic relationship, and I'd had my share. I was there for her and I'd listened to her. But this was somebody who did not come from a narcissistic family of origin. And there was much, much more of a, I don't get this can be fixed, or this fool is going to pay, like this is not okay. Like a very, very marked sense of injustice. This is wrong. What this narcissistic person did was not okay. I compared that to my own experience and the experience of other people who had been through adult narcissistic relationships and didn't have narcissistic parents. And there was less on my side and all those other people who had the narcissistic parents of saying, this is not right, this is not fair. It was much more of a like, here we go again, of course I'm failing at this. The internalization of the self-blame happened more naturally. The people who had narcissistic parents and then ended up in narcissistic adult relationships, yes, felt crazy, but not as much as the crazy as the sad, of course, or here we go again, or I should have known. That's a very different subjective experience. And you may find yourselves when you've talked to other people going through this, and I see this when I work with large groups, that there's two very different discourses of how could they get away with this versus here we go again. And that can mean what can feel like different processes of healing. And all of this starts with depending on what kind of family of origin you had and how heavy a presence narcissism played in one or both of your parents. So I hope that's helpful and helps you realize while these experiences are universal, there are lots of little differences that can happen that can sometimes leave you feeling like, am I going to this because my relationship's not like that person? There's enough similarities, but these histories can shape very different stories. Thanks again.